All right. So as I said, tonight's topic is going to be replacement heifer selection and development. And we'll talk through some of the things to consider from a selection standpoint and then some developmental options for those heifers. But really where I wanted to start with to kind of set the stage for tonight is to pose a question. And when we think about a cow-calf operation, what is going to have the biggest impact on income that's generated from that operation, as well as any profit potential? And reproduction, getting those heifers bred, getting them to have a calf, and getting them the way to raise that calf to weaning is going to have the biggest impact. And the way we really would measure that or think about that is something we'd refer to as the wean calf crop percentage. And the way we would figure that is we would want to go back and hopefully we have records of how many cows we exposed to those bulls. Those cows then got pregnant, were pregnant for 283, 285 days, hopefully had a calf, and then raise that calf up to weaning time. And so we can take the number of calves that were weaned divided by the number of cows that were exposed to bulls, and that'll give us our weaned calf crop percentage. And by far, that's going to be the number one thing that's going to drive income and profit potential in our operation. Now, sell weight of those calves is important, and sell price of those calves is also important, but getting those cows bred and getting them to wean that calf is by far the most important. So when we think about selecting heifers, a lot of the thought process will tie back into how it will affect wean calf crop percent. So when we do think about selection considerations, one of the first things we need to think about is what segment of the industry are you in? Are you a commercial producer who's maybe keeping a few replacement heifers, but then selling the rest of those replacements and then all those steers to go into the feedlot market? Are you more on the seed stock side of things, whether that's registered seed stock or maybe you're trying to raise commercial heifers to sell to other producers? And depending on which part of the industry you're in will change your selection criteria just a little bit. All of those cattle, it's going to be important that they're problem-free cattle, but especially on the commercial side, we're looking for those consistent problem-free cattle. They may not raise the biggest calf by far, but they're going to raise us a good calf every year. Versus, especially if we're looking at on the seed stock side of the industry, where maybe we're trying to raise bulls to sell to commercial producers, we're trying to raise registered females to sell to other breeders. We're really going to be much more selective and put maybe our emphasis in some slightly different areas and looking at some of those curve bending type genetics or those animals that rank high for certain EPDs. So just being a little bit more critical on some of the performance type stuff when we're thinking about selecting potential replacement heifers to go into a seed stock operation. And now the next thing we're going to need to think about in terms of selecting those replacement heifers is what's the marketing goals of our operation? And I already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but are you really just looking at selling all the steer calves and any heifer calves that you don't keep as replacements as stockers or feeders? Because that's going to have some impact, a little impact on the type of heifer we may select. Are you really looking to try to raise replacement heifers for other people? And if you're looking at trying to breed and raise replacement heifers to sell to others, we're going to be a little more selective on those heifers, very, very selective on a disposition standpoint. We should be that way for everything, but especially if you're looking to sell heifers to others, that's a huge impact. And then phenotypically, they kind of fancy heifers, or they more on the plainer side? And if we're just selling stockers or feeders, if they're on the plainer side, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if you are trying to sell replacement heifers to other commercial producers, you really want those heifers that'll catch your eye. And so to do that, you need to select those replacements that will, so you can subsequently raise additional females that will do that. I've already mentioned disposition, but spend a little more time talking on it. We've always known it's important from a convenience standpoint, but we do have data now that supports that there's some other benefits from a production standpoint, whether that be growth or potentially in some situations, if we're doing a lot of ET or AI work, there may potentially have some implications there, but definitely there's implications of just handling those cattle because of the number of times we're going to have to work them through the chute. And then from a marketing standpoint, that's important if we're selling other heifers, if we're just keeping those heifers back for us. Just think about which heifers are more likely to get injured or tear up pens or equipment or those kind of things. It's going to be those heifers that aren't quite as gentle. And then the other thing is if we're just selling cattle, shrink comes into play, and those animals that are calmer will tend to not shrink quite as much as those animals that are not as calm in their temperament. So disposition has a lot of impacts across a lot of operations in the industry, whether you're seed stock, whether you're commercial and selling everything, stockers or feeders, or if you're looking to sell produce replacement heifers and sell to other producers. Fertility is a big one. That's where we started off tonight. And that's one that's a little more challenging. We can't look at those heifers and say this one's going to be fertile and this one isn't. There may be the opportunity, depending on what breed we're dealing with, for some genetic testing of definitely of registered seed stock. But even in some situations, those commercial animals that we may be able to, if it's a breed that has a really good database on the register side, there may be some potential to test some of those commercial cattle, especially as we move forward and genomic testing gets better. The other thing is we know some breeds tend to be more fertile than others, and so that may play into our selection considerations there. One thing we can definitely do to help us select those more fertile females is whether we're purchasing females or especially if we're keeping our own females, we can look at exposing them to a shorter breeding season and really letting those heifers that get bred in that first 30 days of that breeding season help select themselves as future replacements that we want to go into the cow herd. And it doesn't mean that you only have to run a 30-day breeding season if you want to, from a marketing standpoint of those females that aren't going to be kept back in your operation. You may run a traditional 90-day breeding season, but then we go in there and either through ultrasound or timing of blood tests, we determine which heifers bred up in that first 30 days of that breeding season. And those are the ones we're going to select to keep. And then we look at potentially marketing those ones that got bred later in the breeding season. And that's something that's easy to do and works real well when we think about long-term reproduction of those females. We do know that generally speaking, those females that get bred early in the breeding season will tend to continue to get bred early in the breeding season, and they definitely have a better chance of getting bred on a yearly basis versus those ones that start off at the tail end of the breeding season. Feet and legs is something you hear people talk about, but sometimes it doesn't get implemented as well as it should. Definitely something we want to pay attention to, and you can start to see it to some extent on those heifers around weaning time, but especially as they get older, some of these issues start to come into play more. And then we have one breed association that is currently publishing a foot score EPD, and we have several other breed associations that are working on collecting that data. So if you're looking at buying bulls to raise replacement heifers, those foot score EPDs would be something to definitely pay attention to. There's a couple things we want to look at from a foot structure standpoint. One of them is angle. And so talking about how shallow or how deep that heel is. When those heels get real shallow, those toes get longer, and that angle changes and you start to get additional growth on the end of those toes. And that can lead to some problems. But the other aspect of that foot structure that definitely tends to lead to even more problems is the shape of that toe or the shape of that claw. And so if you look on this picture on the left-hand side, you can see, especially on the outside toe on both of these back feet, you can see how we have that curving, and that toe is starting to grow the wrong direction. Now the inside toe is not so bad, but just this outside toe, we kind of have that curvature and even a little bit of a screw shape there to it. That's going to create lameness in that animal, and that can be a heritable condition. So if you have some cows that have been kept for whatever reason but have bad feet, we definitely want to probably avoid keeping any replacement heifers out of them. If we look at the picture on the right, you can see how that toe has started to cross over there, and that does become a painful condition, and you will see those animals limping. And if they're limping, they're not out there grazing as much, and so their condition is going to go down. And from a milk production standpoint, they're just not going to produce as much milk for those calves. So definitely something we want to pay attention to and look at there. This is just an example of the scoring system that some of the breed associations are using. This happens to be one from the Angus Association. So I mentioned the angle or the depth of that heel. And so you can see here that number 9 out here is very undesirable. So that's real shallow heel, real long toes. So those toes don't wear correctly. And so they just continue to get longer and longer. On the other side of the equation, and we don't see near as many problems with this as we do with too shallow of a heel, is that the angle of that hoof is just very straight. And that can cause some problems. Those animals tend to walk pretty stiff, and we can get some joint issues as well. Kind of right here in the middle is what we're looking for. So we have a little bit of angle, and you can see how that corresponds to, we have some angle there in the pastern as well. We don't want too steep of an angle or too straight of the angle in that pastern, because that translates to the angle of that hoof. And so that's that scoring system there. Now, from an EPD standpoint, if you are looking at those EPDs in the Angus Association, the lower the number on that EPD, the more desirable. I will tell you, there's a lot of very popular bulls right now, or bulls that are being heavily used, that don't have very good EPDs from a foot structure standpoint. If we look at the shape of that claw, so that's what we were looking at on the previous slide. You want both of those claws or both of those toes to be as symmetrical as possible. You definitely want to try to avoid any curvature there. So again, the 5 score here in the middle is what we're looking for. You can see as we start to get more curvature to those toes, we have more problems. And even if it's one toe somewhat normal and that other one's curving, that's detrimental and something we want to avoid. And then again, on the other side of the equation is where those claws or those toes really tend to splay out. That can cause some problems as well. We don't see as much of this as we see of the curvature of that claw, and that's something you definitely want to pay attention to. The other thing is environmental adaptability. So how well do those animals fit into your environment? Typically, we're thinking about down here from a heat and humidity standpoint. And so we're really looking at how well those animals slick off their hair coat. And then to me, if those animals are getting into the pond, that's a dead giveaway. They're not handling the temperature or don't have as good of environmental adaptability for that location as those animals that don't. Now, there's a lot of talk about hair coat color. I'm going to tell you, there's not a tremendous amount of data to support some of that talk between red and black. We see quite a bit of absorption of solar radiation on both of those. If you're really looking from a hair coat standpoint, you kind of think more of the extremes of the white or the tan absorbing less of that sunlight compared to a much darker hair coat would. But you can see that's not the only factor that would affect how well these animals can perform in the hot, humid environments, because we have a group of heifers here, all white hair coat, but you see they're out in the pond trying to cool themselves off. So just something to be aware of. If you're buying heifers, you want to try to buy those heifers from an area that you're running cattle in, or at least from an area that's similar. Bringing cattle in from vastly different climates, we tend to see higher culling rates in those animals in a much shorter period of time. And just from a culling standpoint, if you were to think about going out and buying a group of replacement heifers at weaning, I would tell you by the time they got through having their second calf, you probably better plan on that you ended up culling 40 to 60% of those heifers for various reasons. We do see some pretty high cull rates. Now, if you're keeping heifers that you've raised, typically that cull rate's not going to be anywhere near that high, but on purchased heifers, just be aware of that. We definitely want to, when we can, select for heifers that have good fleshing ability, meaning they're staying in better condition on the forage resources we have. We know body condition score and how important it is from a reproduction standpoint. So having those easier fleshing heifers is valuable, and we can make some of those selections as we're going along there. Now, one thing you do want to be aware of is you can go too much the wrong direction in a few situations is when we think about making culling decisions on cows. Sometimes we have cows that stay in really good body condition score, but the reason they're staying in really good body condition score is because they're not producing any milk and they're not raising a very good calf. And if that's the case, why she's staying in good body condition score, that's not something we want. What we want is those cows that stay in good body condition score, but still raise us a really good heifer. And so fleshing ability, you can look at those heifers themselves and see which ones are staying in better condition versus which ones aren't. And then also knowing back to your cow herd if you're keeping replacements out of your own herd. Another benefit is, now this is more from a commercial standpoint. On a seed stock standpoint, we may be trying to turn that generation interval a little quicker because of what we're doing from a selection standpoint. But if you're just commercial producer keeping replacement heifers for yourselves, the more of those heifers that we can keep out of the older cows, typically the better we're going to be. Those cows have proved themselves. We haven't had to cull them for whatever reason. And so they're going to tend to pass more of those traits on to their daughters. So that's something that can be valuable when we have that ability to select those heifers out of those older cows. One thing to pay attention to moving forward is horn versus polled. Anytime we can select polled genetics that are similar in quality to horn genetics, that's something we definitely want to do, whether that's replacement heifers or especially if you're going out and buying bulls, is look for those bulls that are polled so that can pass that along to their offspring. That's beneficial just from working those animals through our facilities and our chutes. We don't have to worry about those horns banging around on things. From a transportation standpoint, with horned animals, we have to allow extra space in that trailer. So we may be having to use, or we're going to increase freight costs and those kind of things by having to provide that additional space. Now with the polled animals, we don't want to pack them into the trailer by any means, but we don't have to allow quite as much space when we don't have those horns. And then I think that's going to be something for some of these branded programs moving forward, is they're likely going to require those animals to be polled in those situations. And when we just think about from a welfare standpoint, is if we don't have to dehorn those animals mechanically and we do it through a genetic standpoint, that's valuable because we're not exposing that animal to any pain when we're dehorning there. So something to definitely think about and be aware of. Mature size is one we hear talked about a lot of times, and that's one a lot of people, they don't want really big cows, but they actually end up with cows bigger than what they think they have in a lot of situations. So one way you can kind of monitor that is when you sell those cull cows, see how much they weighed. And that mature size or that mature body weight, we're talking about what would be the body weight of that cow when she's in moderate condition, so body condition score of 5, and she's either open or she's short bred. So let's say instead of a body condition score of 5, when you sold her, she was a body condition score of 4. roughly you can add 80 to 100 pounds back to that weight of that animal, and that would get you back to that mature size. Now, what's the right mature size? It really depends on the environment you're in. If we're out in West Texas or the Western US and we're running a cow-calf pair to 100 acres, we probably want to be looking at a 900 or 1,000-pound cow in that situation. If we're here in East Texas, 1,200-pound cows fine, and even a 1,300 to 1,400-pound cow is probably reasonable in a lot of situations. We definitely, though, want to avoid those 1,600 or 1,800 pound cows in our situation. So we do want to be mindful of mature size. And when we're thinking about keeping heifers, one of the temptations is always to keep the biggest, heaviest heifers. Well, we have to be careful of doing that, because if we do that in a lot of situations, what's that going to mean is we're just going to select for those heifers that are going to grow into those bigger and bigger cows over time. And so you may want to even look at taking the top 10% of the heifer crop from a size standpoint and look at selling those, and then keeping your replacement heifers after that to help control that mature size. Now, I will tell you from a genetic standpoint, historically, as we tried to select for more growth, whether that be from a weaning weight standpoint or especially a yearling weight standpoint, when we selected for more growth, generally that meant we ended up with more mature weight as well, or heavier mature weights in those animals. I've shared this bull here because of some of the advancements we made in genomic testing and selection of animals. This is a bull that's been identified in the Angus breed. He's a young bull, but he's going to get a lot of AI use here over the next couple of years, and we'll see if his EPDs go ahead and play out the way they look now. And I think there's a very good chance of that happening, at least for some of the primary EPDs. But if we look at this bull, just to kind of show you, and I realize this is a bit small, but I wanted to get it all on the screen, so I'll go ahead and read these numbers off to you. So from a calving ease direct standpoint, this bull would be in the top 5% of the breed. So the top 5% of being very, very easy calving. But then if we look at from a growth standpoint, from a yearling weight standpoint, he's a 142 on his yearling weight EPD, which also puts him in the top 5% of the breed. So extremely easy calving, but extremely fast growth as well. And we're starting to see more and more of that. But then what we typically see, if we look over here at mature weight EPD, you would see those animals rank similarly in the breed to what they did from a yearling weight standpoint. But if we look at this bull in particular, he's top 5% of the breed from a growth standpoint, but he's 60th percentile of the breed. So from a mature weight standpoint, meaning he, or especially his daughters, are going to weigh less than breed average when we're talking about mature size based on current EPDs. And that's not something we see a lot. But as we do a better job from a genomic testing and recording some of that data moving forward, we can start to identify some of these animals that are very unique from a growth curve standpoint, which really good growth, but we can control that mature size at the same time. So just wanted to point out, if you are doing some AI work or some of those things, depending on the breed, some of this data may be available to you, and that's something you may want to look at. Kind of some other interesting things about this bull as we think about replacement heifers. He currently ranks in the top 1% of the breed for heifer pregnancy EPD, top 10% of the breed for calving ease maternal EPD, which is what we would want to select for if we're selecting for daughters. That would mean we would expect his daughters to be easier calving than a lot of the other heifers in the breed. And then if you needed to add some milk, top 4% of the breed. We look at docility EPD, 30%, so not bad there. And then if we look at foot score EPDs, top 10%, top 1% on foot angle there. Very unique. We typically don't see a lot of bulls that are this maternal oriented on so many traits. And as he proves himself out, are these EPDs going to change? Yes, some of them will, but if he'll prove himself out close to where he sits right now, really unique genetics that could really impact a lot of the cattle industry. And there's some other bulls that would be similar with some of these, but maybe not quite as complete across the whole board as this bull is right now. Another thing we can kind of look at when we're really trying to select those females is, instead of just selecting the heaviest ones, what we want to try to get into the mentality of is selecting those heifers that are closer to reaching some of the target breeding weights we would talk about. And those target breeding weights would be as a percent of their estimated mature weight. So a lot of times we talk about wanting to breed those heifers, develop them so they're 65% of their mature body weight. So if we think about how close are they reaching that target, if we just look at the two heifers here in this example, so the first heifer at weaning, she's weighing 575. The second heifer is weighing 625. Well, just if that's all we considered, we'd probably lean to that heifer weighing 625. But if we kind of knew what cows those heifers were out of and how big of a cow we thought they were going to make, if we say, well, this 575 cow is going to be a little more on the lower end of that moderate scale and only maturing to a 1,200 pound cow, then her target breeding weight would be 780 pounds. And if we look at her current weight in relation to a mature weight, she's at almost 48%. Okay. If we look at this other heifer and say, well, no, she's going to be a little bigger cow. She's going to be on the high end of that kind of moderate range and be a 1,400 pound cow. Her target breeding weight would be 910. So we got to get her a little bit bigger. If we think about her in relation to her mature weight, she's a little less than 45%. So, and you may not sit down and do the exact math on this, but you can kind of eyeball those heifers and think about which ones are going to be bigger, which ones aren't, based on what cows are out of. And then you can also look at the cannon bone, which is that bone going from the knee to the ankle on the front leg. The longer that's going to be, the bigger those heifers will tend to be when we're looking at it from a frame size standpoint. So if we're trying to look at heifers that are further along in their growth process, this example of this number one heifer would be more of the type we would want to keep, because she's further along in reaching her target breeding weight and as a percentage of her mature weight. Another thing we think about is milk production, which is going to change depending on what kind of environment we're in. If we're in a low rainfall environment, we're not going to want as much milk production, because we can actually get heifers and cows that produce so much milk in that environment that they just don't have a very good chance of breeding back. So what ends up happening is they raise a bigger calf every other year versus that cow that's a little more moderate or lower in her milk production is getting bred back and raising a calf every year. In contrast, if we're in a situation where we're grazing a cow-calf pair to 3 acres or 5 acres in a higher rainfall area, we can stand to have those cows produce a little bit more milk so that they may produce a little bit bigger calf at weaning. So really on milk production, it's about matching it to our forage resources and our environment. Regardless of what your environment is, udder and teat structure is going to be important. From a teat standpoint, we don't want those teats really big because that makes it hard for those newborn calves to get a hold of that teat and nurse, which can cause some problems. And then we don't want those teats to be extremely long or extremely short. But the biggest thing we're going to look at first is size. And then from an udder structure standpoint, we want good suspension of that udder. So if we look at this cow here, she's nice and even across all 4 quarters. We got nice suspension in that udder. It's not hanging down to the ground there. And so that's something to be aware of. That's not something we can look at those replacement heifers and really tell. So we have to know what cows they're out of, or what the bull they're out of, what does his dam look like from an udder standpoint. All right. Another thing from a selection standpoint to think about is this is some work done by L.R. Sprott, former beef cattle specialist out of College Station, where he looked at across several different ranches here. They bred heifers and then they took the heifers that didn't breed and they waited 6 months and tried to breed them again and looked at the percentage of those heifers that kept. What did the breed up look at like on the second time? And so you can see breed description here and number of heifers, but the really big thing we're looking at is of those heifers that were kept and given a second chance, how many of them got bred? So you can see these first two herds, 53, 56, 98% here. That tells us they didn't have those heifers developed well enough that first time. That's going to be very rare there. And then you see ranging from 47 to 63%, and the rest of these bring us cross females. And then the higher percentage of Brahmin influence is 32%. But the big thing is across all these heifers, only about 58% of them got bred when they were given a second chance, and that includes this really high group. So what that tells us is if we've developed those heifers properly and they didn't get bred that first go round, probably not something we want to keep and try to get bred from a second during a second breeding season. Now, cows, especially first calf cows that had their first calf and maybe didn't get bred on time for that second calf, if you wanted to hold them and roll them into another breeding season, that's a different story. But those heifers really probably don't want to keep them if they didn't get bred that first time. So that's kind of some things to think about from a selection standpoint. So then to kind of wrap up looking at heifer development and management of those heifers. And what are our goals when we think about replacement heifers? Well, the first thing is I want her to calve unassisted without any problems. We want her to raise a good calf, okay, because there's sometimes a temptation to go out there and use some breeds that maybe have really, really, really small calves, but realize those calves are going to be really small at weaning. And so it's not just about getting a live calf on the ground, but we want a live calf that's going to be good as well when we go to sell them. And then we want to set that heifer up that she raises that good calf every year for the next, hopefully, 10 to 12 years or more. So when we think about some target breeding weights, and then from an age standpoint as well, so typically we're looking at breeding those heifers at 13 and a half to 15 months of age. So they're calving roughly around 24 months of age. The big thing is we want those heifers to be 65% of their mature body weight. So when we get ready to breed. And so that's one of the big reasons I was talking about, thinking about when we're selecting them at weaning, how would they be in relation to their mature body weight? So if we're talking about those cows or those heifers, developing into a 1,300 pound cow, 65% of that is we would want those heifers to be weighing at least about 845 pounds when we got ready to breed them. Now, you may have seen some stuff in the popular press where they talk about only developing those heifers to 55% of mature body weight. And that can be done. Just realize, especially if you have a little more Brahmin influence in them, we're probably really going to hurt breed up on those heifers, which if you're really trying to select for extreme fertility, that they may not be such an issue. The other thing is, even if we save a little bit of money initially by not growing those heifers as much, we still got to get them to our target calving weight. So we're going to have to put additional feed resources in them then. Where most of that work was done, where they were looking at only developing them at 55%, was in an area of the country where they typically pin them up during the winter and they dry lot them and feed them in a dry lot. Versus if we look at us down here in East Texas or Central Texas, we have those heifers out on grass and grazing. And so our cost structure is a little bit different. And so I think that 65% of mature body weight is still a good target for us in our environment. If we look at target calving, like I mentioned, we want them calving around 24 months of age. So kind of thinking about that 23 to 25 month window. We're going to want those heifers to be at least 85% of their mature body weight when we get ready to calve them. So if we think about a 1,300 pound mature weight, we're wanting those heifers to be a little over 1,100 pounds when it's time to calve. And just want to comment while I'm on this real quick, because a question often comes up is sometimes people are worried about feeding those heifers during late gestation because they're worried about what it's going to do on birth weight of those calves. And a extremely high nutrition plan can affect birth weight, but you're not going to do that if you're supplementing those cows or those heifers. Your pocketbook would stop you long before you ever got to that situation. The only time I really get worried about birth weights of those calves getting really big from a nutrition standpoint is I wouldn't want to take a heifer in the last 3 months of pregnancy and put her out on cool season annual pasture full time. We would want to make sure we limit graze those heifers or even potentially cows in late gestation. Otherwise, if we're just feeding them hay or they're grazing pasture and we're supplementing them a little bit, we don't have to worry about that nutrition having that kind of impact. We need really high levels of both protein and energy. And the only practical place we're really going to see that is from grazing winter pasture. The other thing when we think about developing heifers and thinking about from weaning until breeding is we do have to be cautious about getting those heifers extremely fat between about 4 and 10 months of age, which we're not breeding them till they're 13 and a half to 14, but we are past that weaning window there. Is that udder is sensitive to excess fat deposition from about 4 to 10 months of age in those heifers. And if they get that extra fat, they're going to end up producing less milk for that first calf and maybe even a little less milk for that second calf. Now, from a breeding standpoint, we could start those heifers off slow and then pick them up as long as we got to that target weight, or we could kind of grow them evenly all the way through as long as we got to that target weight, or we could start them off faster and then slow them down. And it really wouldn't matter which strategy we picked from a reproduction standpoint on those heifers, as long as we hit that 65% mature body weight we're talking about. But we would probably want to avoid this top one of starting them off fast and slowing them down, because that's going to get us into an issue potentially with that excess fat in the udder. So I'd really want to look more at either going consistent with them, or I definitely don't mind going a little slower. And then if I need to, speeding them up at the end. And why we may do this is because we try to run them on grass as much as possible. And if we just see our grazing conditions aren't quite good enough, then that last 3 to 4 months, we could go ahead and supplement those heifers some more and bump them up. But if we started them on grass and our grass was plenty good, then we could save that money from a supplementation standpoint. So how much do we need those heifers to gain? So if we look at weaning those heifers at about 7 months of age, breed them at 14 months of age, and I kind of started off on the lower end and said they were only weighing 40% of their mature weight when we weaned them. And really, we're going to want them to be a little bit more than that, but just to kind of show if we were only at 40%. So if they're going to be 1,300 pound cows, that means we have a target of 845. So if we look at the difference, 845 and minus 520, that tells us we need to put 325 pounds on those heifers. We have 7 months to do so, or 210 days. So that tells us we would need those heifers gaining 1.5 pounds or 1.55 pounds a day in that situation. If we look at heifers that are a little heavier at weaning there, so they're more that 45% of mature body weight, we would only need to put 260 pounds of weight on those heifers across that same 210 days, only 1.25 pounds a day. So you can see there's some benefits selecting those heifers that are a little further along in relation to their mature body weight at weaning. If we look at from breeding to calving, so going from 14 months of age when we bred her to having her calve at about 23 and a half months of age, we're going from 845 to 1105 in this example. And again, thinking about a 1,300 pound mature weight. So 260 pounds of weight divided by our 285 days is we need those heifers gaining a little under 1 pound a day would be adequate. And with good grazing conditions, we could definitely do that in that situation. So from a cost standpoint, the more we can develop these heifers on grass, the better off we're going to be. So I wanted to take just a few minutes here to kind of talk about some of our forages and what kind of performance we could potentially expect on replacement heifers under good to excellent grazing conditions. So if we look at some of our native warm season perennial forages, so things like big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, little blue stem, those heifers with good to excellent grazing management, we would expect to see somewhere between a pound and 2.25 pounds a day in performance. And you may be saying, well, that's quite a bit more than what we would see on some of our introduced warm season perennials. And it can be, but a lot of that difference may not be so much difference in physiology differences in those species. There's some of that. But with these native forages, we have to make sure we graze them much easier or much lighter. And so typically we would only let those cows consume about 25% of what's out there. Whereas if we're talking about things like Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, we may let them consume 65% or more. So if we're not forcing them to consume as much, we're restricting that. It allows them to be a little more selective and eat some of the better quality or higher quality portions of those plants. So kind of give you an idea on the warm season native perennials. If we look at our warm season introduced perennials, and so we don't need near as many acres to run the same amount of cattle as we would on the natives. If we look at things like oral blue stems, and these are different than little blue stem and big blue stem. Here we're talking about things like WWB doll, KR blue stem, King Ranch blue stem. And we do see a little more variation in this group. And some of the better varieties, we may even see a little bit higher performance. But the oral blue stems would kind of fit in that 1 to 1.6 pound a day group. Tifton 85 would fit in that group as well. And remember, Tifton 85 isn't straight Bermuda grass. It's a Bermuda grass, stargrass cross. Johnson grass, we typically don't graze it very much just because it's so palatable. The cattle will actually graze it out and it won't come back. But just to show you, if you ended up with some Johnson grass hay, kind of how it would compare to other species, and it would be in this little higher category here. If we kind of look at the next group down, and you can see there's a little bit of overlap here, but 0.7 to 1.3 pounds a day. And again, this is good to excellent grazing management. And unfortunately, a lot of the pastures I see, we just couldn't classify them as excellent grazing management. But we'd be talking about things like Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Dallas grass, even if we're a little further west, Klein grass, and that 0.7 to 1.3 pound a day range. If we look at our warm season introduced annuals, so things like sorghum Sudan or Sudan grass, 2 to 2.75 pounds a day. Crabgrass or pearl millet, we'd kind of be looking at 1.25 pounds to 2 pounds a day. So you can see those annuals we get a little better performance out of than the perennials. If we look at our cool season introduced annuals, and this is definitely where we would see our best performance on replacement heifers, and this is one of the most cost-effective ways to raise replacement heifers, is things like ryegrass or small grains, whether that be rye, wheat, oats, or something else. We're looking at 1.5 to 2.85 pounds a day. And so that may even be one of those situations if you had some heifers that were going to get bred during the spring, is you could start them off a little slower. And then if we had winter pasture, we could put them on. We could really get a lot of performance and weight gain out of those heifers in a short period of time before that spring breeding season. So just to walk through some more specific examples here of how this may work for a potential operation. So just looking at development of a late winter born heifer here. So I just said she was born February 1st. We're gonna wean her September 1. So she's 7 months of age at weaning. Looking at that kind of lower end again of only 40% of mature body weight. So say she's weaning at 520. we need to get her bred around April 1st, weighing about 845. So if we kind of think from September 1 to January 1, grazing, actively growing Bermuda grass part of that time, and then we would have to do a good job of stockpiling Bermuda grass, meaning we went in there and fertilized it with about 60 pounds of nitrogen the first part of September, let it grow from first part of September to the middle of November, and then grazing it from middle of November to January 1. If we kind of look at that window, that 120-day window there, kind of expect those heifers to gain 0.85 pounds a day. So we'd get 102 pounds of weight gain from about September 1 to January 1 with good to excellent grazing management. Then if we look at, we've planted some ryegrass, and it's come up early because we fertilized it around Thanksgiving, and we didn't stock it too heavy so we could go full-time grazing with it early on, and realized we wouldn't have quite as much available January 1. And as we went through that from January 1 to April 1, we'll get even more of that ryegrass and that performance would pick up, but kind of looking at an average of 2.5 pounds a day over that period. So in that 90 days, getting about 225 pounds of weight gain on those heifers. So if we looked at starting at 520, we got 102 pounds from September 1 to January 1. We got 225 pounds from January 1 to April 1. Remember, that's when we're breeding her. Those heifers would be weighing about 847 pounds when we got ready to start breeding on them, which would meet the target we were looking for. So here we could develop those heifers just under grazing, but we're going to have to use some fertilizer, and we're going to have to put some ryegrass or another winter annual or cool season annual in there. So we talked about from weaning to breeding. Now we're going to talk about with the same heifer from breeding to calving. So we bred her April 1st, 14 months of age, weighing about 845 pounds. She's going to end up calving about January 15th. So she's actually not quite 24 months old. She'd only be 23 and a half. We got to hit that target of 1,105 pounds there. So going with this bred heifer now from April 1st to May 1st, we still should have some good ryegrass grazing for about 30 days there, figuring she's going to gain 2.5. And I have her a little higher than previously because remember I told you January is probably going to be a little less weight gain than we would have later in the season. Just that 30 days probably get around 75 pounds of weight gain on that bred heifer. Going from May 1 to January 15th. So the next 255 days. And so you can see 255 plus 30, that's our 285 days of gestation. Really grazing Bermuda grass and stockpile Bermuda grass during that time, about 9/10 of a pound. And yes, I realize that's a little higher than what I used when she was younger, but that's because these older animals would do a little bit better on Bermuda grass. So I kind of figured that in there. So if we look at, she's at breeding started at 847, 75 pounds when she was grazing ryegrass, just under 230 pounds when she was grazing growing Bermuda grass and then stockpile Bermuda grass. Looking at that heifer being a little over 1,150 pounds, more than met our weight there. Now looking at a fall calving example, so now we're going to step back to getting that heifer bred, and then we'll look at her from when she's bred until when she calves. So fall born heifer calf are born April 15th, going to wean her May 15th, weighing about being 7 months old, weighing about 618 pounds. That'd be about 47.5% of her mature body weight. You may say, well, why did you figure the same age heifer weighing quite a bit more than we did when we looked at the other heifer that was kind of born late winter? And the reason being is these fall born heifers, if we have winter pasture that we can put those pairs on, those cows are going to milk more. Plus those nursing heifers are going to gain more because they have access to that high quality ryegrass. So those fall born calves are typically going to be heavier at weaning. So just went ahead and accounted for that there. In this situation, we're weaning her May 15th. We need to breed her around the middle of December. Same target breeding weight there. So looking at going from May 15th to December 15th, combination of grazing and growing Bermuda grass and stockpile Bermuda grass. And in this situation, because of where she's at and kind of some time periods there, a pound a day over that 210 days. So 618 plus 210, she's weighing 828. So she's a little under her target. I would tell you that probably wouldn't bother me, especially if you keep a few extra heifers and you expose them to that short breeding window so you can really start to select those more fertile heifers. We don't have her quite where we want her, but we got her close enough that we were probably okay in that situation. If you wanted to get her a little closer, we would just look at later in the period here, feeding a couple pounds of an energy supplement, and we could easily add a little extra weight to get her at or above that 845. Now, the heifers we got bred looking at going from December 15th to when they would be calving October 1st, and again, calving at 23 and a half months of age, same 1,105 pound target. So from December 15th to January 1, eating a little bit of stockpiled Bermuda grass there, getting us a little bit of weight gain, not a tremendous amount, but then going from January 1 to May 1 and actually putting her on ryegrass. She's early gestation and into mid gestation just a little bit. Totally fine to have her on ryegrass or cool season annual at that point in time. Gaining, figured 2.35 in this scenario. So she gained 282 pounds just in that 4-month period from that ryegrass. And then the ryegrass going, or excuse me, Bermuda grass going from May 1 to October 1, 150 days there, gaining about 135 pounds. We started her a little under our target at 828, but then we put some weight on her, 13 and a half, 282 pounds here, 135 pounds here. We only had a target calving weight of 1105, but she's actually calving weighing closer to 1260. And that's what we would expect with the fall calving example. And we need that little extra development because these fall calving heifers or cows are going to lose a little bit more weight during the winter than what our late winter calving female would. But just to kind of show you some examples, is if we're not overstocked, we use the right forages, we fertilize them appropriately, we can develop these heifers on just grass or on just grass with a little bit of supplementation. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover tonight. So any questions anybody has, feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask those, or go ahead and type those in the chat box and we'll be happy to get those answered. So any questions? So good question. Question came in, if you're going to use natural surface, is there a simple strategy to synchronize those heifers before introducing them to the bull? Absolutely. There's two of them that I would consider that I actually use on our heifers in our family operation. One of those is you could just give them a shot of prostaglandin, which would be something like Lutalice or Estramate. And what that does is any heifers that have a CL, which is a structure on the ovary, any heifers that have that CL, when we give them a prostaglandin, it will lyse that CL and it will cause them to come into heat within 48 to 72 hours. Of all those heifers that are cycling, so let's just say we have 100% of the heifers cycling and we gave them that one shot of that prostaglandin, we would expect 81% of those heifers to be in heat within about 5 days. So you're looking at about $3 for that shot, and you can get a very large portion of those bred early in the season. Another question that came in is, should you breed the heifers to calve earlier than the cows? And I know you hear that a lot, but I'm going to tell you, I'm really not a big proponent of that. And there's a couple reasons I'm not. Because what happens in a lot of situations is people breed those heifers to calve earlier than the cow herd, but then they don't wean the calves until they wean everything. And so now we've just forced that heifer to nurse that calf longer than the cow herd. So if you are going to calve those heifers earlier, than the cow herd, make sure you wean those calves earlier than what you would the cow herd. The other kind of thing I'm not so crazy about breeding those heifers earlier is if we've done a good job of developing and selecting heifers, there's no reason we can't get a very high percentage of them bred back by having them calve the same time as what the cows are going to do. And I really don't want to treat those heifers extremely differently. I want to put a lot of pressure on them so I can select heifers that are going to make better cows. The other thing about having those heifers calve a month earlier than the cow herd, now we've just increased the amount of time that we have to go about checking calving females, whether those are heifers or calves. So personally, I like calving the heifers at the same time we start the cow herd. If you wanted to calve them early, just make sure you wean those calves off early and you're aware of that. The other thing that comes up with that question is if we are going to synchronize those heifers and turn the bulls in with them, do we need more bulls? And you'll hear people say, well, you need to increase your or decrease your ratio so you have more bulls in relation to those heifers or the cows you're synchronized. I don't think that's the case. There's some data out there, some older data, but they looked at turning bulls in with synchronized females in ratios anywhere from 1 bull to 5 heifers or 1 bull up to like 70 plus heifers. And they really didn't see a difference in conception rates regardless of that ratio. And they were exposing those bulls to those heifers for about a week when they had them, and they synchronized all those heifers. So that tells us those bulls can handle more than what we think in a lot of those situations. And the other thing is, okay, let's say he only got 70% of them bred in that first few days when they were synchronized. Those heifers are going to come back in 21 days, and he can just go ahead and breed the rest of them at that point in time. So you don't have to go out there and purchase additional bulls if you do want to synchronize those heifers. And I think that's very valuable to do. And you can use that same one-shot prostaglandin strategy on the cow herd. It's not quite as easy as the heifers because now you are dealing with pairs. Well, if you don't have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and log off. I'll wait here a little bit longer before we end the meeting. But thank everybody for joining tonight and hope you have a good evening.